I want to welcome everyone to the June 2024 meeting of the 1904 World's Fair Society. I think most everybody knows I'm Mike Truax, and today is the 120th year anniversary of the 1904 World's Fair, and it's also the 38th anniversary of the Society this year. So pat yourselves on the back for being around here for 38 years, going into our 39th. Today, a member of the Missouri Historical Society, Magdalene Linck, is going to give us a presentation. She's a music historian, and she's going to tell us about some of the World's Fair sheet music and how she's used it in her studies. And there is a volume control for this over there, but I'm not sure how it works. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Hopefully on the internet you can hear me too. We have a special donated attendance prize or two on the table as you came in. There's 2 pieces of World's Fair sheet music that were donated to us from Mel Getlin's collection, and just arrived at my door a while ago because his widow was cleaning out some stuff and she found some other World's Fair things. So far this has been a very busy year with the new exhibit at the History Museum and our fantastic society picnic that Nan had a lot to do with. How many people went to the picnic? How many people didn't go to the picnic? Ooh. Oh, blood transfusion. Okay. I'd like to ask if there are any first-time or new members here tonight, or non-members. Are we all full of members? Oh, there's somebody back there. When he comes up, we'll maybe see if he wants to tell us his name and stuff like that. I do have a couple of announcements to pass to everyone that are not in the bulletin. First of all, on the sign-in table, there's some sign-up sheets. The Missouri History Museum has invited the Society to set up inside the History Museum next week on Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday for live performances downstairs in the theater of Meet Me in St. Louis. It's on their website. It's done by a young youth group. There are some, little kids that you might expect for Tootie, etc. It's a great opportunity for the Society to engage the public, especially on a weekend when the place gets a little more crowded, and tell them what the Society is and does and what we know about the fair. Setups will be Thursday evening at about 5 o'clock, and then Saturday and Sunday afternoons at about 1:30. And if you know that you're available, or if you want to go to the History Museum and see the exhibit again, you can do that around, our schedule. And if we have enough people, we can take turns, go see the exhibit. It's a fun place to go see because so many people are looking at that and going, well, what's that building? Or where are we now? And things like that. And we can all help them out. Next month, on Saturday, July 20th at noon, we'll have our monthly meeting at Glen Echo Country Club. Have any of you golfers ever been out to Glen Echo before? No. Any long-term members been out to Glen Echo Country Club? When was the last time we went there? We did an Olympic thing there. When? That's the toughie. I'm thinking it might have been 2016 or 2012 or something like that. It's been a long time. Glen Echo was the first golf course west of the Mississippi, and they hosted the golfing events for the 1904 World's Fair. Out of focus. Oh. Did that happen all of a sudden when I was waving the paper around, or I blocked it out? Well, when in doubt, reset it. I chose to do that this year because this is an Olympic year. Who knows when the last Olympic year was?
3 years ago.
Was it 2020 or 2021?
Technically, it was.
Oh yeah, COVID.
The Summer Olympics, you're counting the Winter Olympics.
Summer Olympics. And I'm.
Yeah.
Okay. So don't block the camera again. There's always something. Who said that? Rosanna Dana. Okay, so on July 20th, we'll go out to Glen Echo and we're going to have a very nice catered buffet lunch to include a salad, a chicken entree with sides and desserts. There will be a fee, and the next bulletin will contain some instructions of how to sign up for that. And it'll be $32, and that covers the room fee and the service charge. So while that may sound kind of like an expensive lunch, you're going to a 1904 Olympic venue and getting a very nice meal. So I'd like to set the stage for this presentation by traveling back to Saturday, June 11th, 1904, 120 years ago today. Fair officials say they had resolved an issue that threatened to disrupt the U.S. government Indian exhibit. A group of Arapahoes threatened to leave the fair. They claimed they were underfed. The exhibit managers ensured that food was adequate, got them some more, and that they were going to stay at least for a while more. St. John's Military School from Salinas, Kansas was camped on the fairgrounds, and they performed in the drill competition, marching on the Plaza of St. Louis with rifles and stuff like that. They run the pennant, a flag for best drilled at the World's Fair, and a large crowd cheered them on. There were always Army troops and other college troops and stuff attending the fair and staying in tents on the fairgrounds. 120 years ago, it was East St. Louis Day. Thousands paraded across the Eads Bridge and then out to the fairground. They were led by Mayor Cook and the city council. A caravan of 200 automobiles followed them as the businesses and schools in East St. Louis were closed, of course. Thieves struck one of several candy stands operated by Mrs. R.A. Glenn. It was the fourth time her stock had been stolen. There was an article in the Globe Democrat that noted the following interesting information. She is a brunette who dresses in the best of taste, and she sobbed that she didn't understand why the thieves so persistently followed her. Good reporting. Today was special, though. The Cascades were illuminated with colored lights for the first time behind and below the water. Each cascade had 14 waterfalls and was about 300 feet in length. Over 50,000 gallons of water flowed every minute into the Grand Basin, inspiring Scott Joplin to write The Cascades. Now, interestingly, according to the Joplin Society and the Friends of Scott Joplin, he did not attend the fair, but he saw the fair probably under construction on the Sundays that you could go see it. But he saw the Cascades and where the water was going to come down, and he wrote the book, The Cascades. And I have a copy of that sheet music, and I think Magdalene's going to talk about that. So let me tell you about Magdalene Linck. She's an assistant librarian and curatorial assistant at the Librarian Research Center of the Missouri Historical Society. That's that big building on Skinker. She's worked there for the past 8 years. She is a student of Black Studies with a focus on early to mid 20th century music, which includes the fair. She uses her expertise in presentations like this to examine the culture and mores of the period. I'm sure she'll take a few questions afterwards, and I have a chore or two for you to do, like drawing attendance prize winners and stuff like that. So with that, I give you Magdalene Linck.
I just need to share that.
Switch that over to the, come on, presentation, and then go screen. Okay, we got full screen.
Perfect.
And just pushing the left button or the space bar advances.
Perfect. All right. All right. So thank you all so much for having me. I thought I was gonna have to correct my intro, but I don't. My job title changed recently, but apparently I got it right when I when I booked the talk. Anyway, but this particular talk is called Piking the Pike, Exploring the Sounds of the 1904 World's Fair. So I'm gonna do a couple quick notes before we start. So first off, the primary focus of this presentation is to explore the kind of sheet music that was inspired by the fair.
Have you shared your presentation?
Did I? I don't,
Otherwise, people.
I don't
will
know
share.
if,
You're
did we?
Absolutely wonderful presenter.
Let's do, let's see.
I
Yeah,
think
there
the
we go.
green button down there. Yes,
Perfect. Are we back?
and then go back to full screen.
Okay,
Now-
perfect. Got it.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. All right, back on track. Okay.
They choose.
Good time to take a picture before the next.
So we'll be looking at composers, lyricists, publishers, who put out works in the years kind of surrounding the fair. So some stuff came out a little bit before and some stuff came out a little bit afterwards. There is some overlap with music that was played on the fairgrounds and or on the Pike, but that's not just the focus of this presentation. So I've kind of tried to thematically link each section, but it gets a little murky and it's by no means perfect. So second of all of the sheet music and the vast majority of the images in the presentation are from the collection of the Missouri Historical Society. There's some stuff that is not ours, but for the most part, a lot of the images are from our collection. And actually, I originally did this presentation at the Librarian Research Center and had a show and tell afterwards with all of the stuff that's seen here, but Mike actually brought in some of the sheet music that we'll look at today, which is in the back. So I encourage you to look at it before you take off today. And last but not least, or I guess third, it's not quite last. There's some subject matter and imagery in this presentation that by today's standards, we would view as problematic or, it might make us uncomfortable. That said, it's reflective of the time, and I think it's really important to view these images as part of a larger story and context. So I could have avoided this entirely, but I chose not to. So I really, really strongly believe in kind of the importance of preserving these stories, and I think it's important not to just gloss over anything that might make us uncomfortable today. So I chose this particular image that was created in 2015 by a local artist named Vincent Tolles Jr. Just to kind of emphasize that talking point. And this particular poster was designed to kind of emphasize the inequalities in St. Louis that existed during the fair, but also how that connected to, current issues in St. Louis. And getting ahead of myself. And last but not least, I'm going to try really hard to look up occasionally and try to answer questions, but I might not get to all of them. So I'm going to try to leave some time at the end as well. I also have, I brought my business card with me. I thought I didn't, but I did. So if there's anything that you want to ask me about that you don't get a chance to ask me about, just please feel free to shoot me an email, or you can come and see me at the library. I'm there 4 or 5 days a week, depending on the week. And the last thing I want to say is that, I don't know everything about the fair. I don't think anybody does know everything about the fair. I don't think I can answer every question, and I don't think anybody could. Not even the people in our institution who worked on the new exhibit. There's so much work and research that has been done about the fair. But there are still things that we don't know and things that we're finding out. And so I'm going to be the first to tell you that, I don't know everything. This is actually the first time this is the second time I've given this presentation, but this is the first time I've ever done kind of a deep dive into this particular aspect of the World's Fair. So outside of, helping people with reference questions and stuff in the library, this is actually the first time I've ever done this type of research. So I'm very, very aware that I am the first to note that, by no means is this perfect.
Is there a way to have this just take? I think everybody's
Oh,
seeing
they're
this
seeing
side,
that too.
yeah.
Got it. I didn't
I don't
realize.
know
Let's
how they
see.
go, we're-
Let's
it's
see.
setting up that everybody sees it.
Is that working?
That,
Is that better?
there's a delay, but you're good.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Now that's wrong. Okay, hold on. Let's see. We'll go back. Hang on. I'll try this one more time.
I was seeing it the way you're wanting to present.
Yeah, and then we got the wrong view. Okay, hold on. There's a little bit of a lag. All right. Display settings, duplicate slideshow. Is that better?
There we go.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Hopefully we won't have any more technical difficulties, but I appreciate everybody bearing with us. All right. Okay. All right, we're back on track. So I will say that when I first gave this presentation, no, this is here. My goodness. There we go. No problem. We're just finding all kinds of stuff. I know. Let me see if I can move this out of the way too.
Write it down.
We're gonna roll with this morning, or this afternoon, evening. I have a toddler. I have no concept of time. Yeah, I know.
Drag that bar
Hold
down
on.
the block.
Yeah. I can't, it won't let me drag it. I'm just gonna leave it. Okay, so when I first gave this particular presentation, I was giving it to kind of a general audience. So some of this information at the very beginning about kind of basic stats of the fair, I'm sure you all are all familiar with, so I'm going to kind of buzz through it a little bit. But the World's Fair officially opened on April 30th of 1904. There was an estimated 250,000 people who visited during the first day, which started with a parade and ceremony. And I have some excerpts from newspapers, which I was hoping it just seems like there's a little bit of a delay. Okay. We're just having all kinds of fun problems. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So these excerpts are from the St. Louis Republic newspaper, and they detail the schedule. It's a little bit hard to read. It's quite a long article, so I just picked out a couple parts of it. The gates officially opened at 8 a.m. with a parade and ceremony starting around 9 a.m. This particular schedule mentions several different songs that were performed, and John Philip Sousa and his band were on hand. And here we have a photograph that shows the chorus as well as Sousa's band towards the front. And this is an advertisement for the pieces that Sousa's band performed during the opening of the fair. So they performed 2 of the 3 official pieces of music that were composed in conjunction with the fair. Those 2 songs were Louisiana and Hymn of the West. Alfred Ernst, who was the conductor of the St. Louis Choral Symphony at the time, was on hand to direct a chorus. And alongside those pieces, Sousa's band also performed America and the Star Spangled Banner. So I'm going to jump right into our first piece of music. So this is one of the 3 official pieces that were composed for the fair. So I say 3 official pieces because there were only 3 songs that the kind of directors and organizers had commissioned for the fair. There are tons of songs that were written about the fair and that were inspired by it, but there were only 3 that were official, so to speak. So this one is called Along the Plaza, and it was written by a well-known composer, an East Coast native named Henry Kimball Hadley, and he wrote the song in 1904. He primarily wrote classical pieces, though later in his career, he actually conducted music for Warner Brothers studios. So this is a picture of Hadley. And he was a really prolific and standout talent to write a piece of music for the fair. And I kind of suspect that the organizers kind of used this as a, by getting him, it was kind of a way for them to show that they were kind of at the cutting edge of, they were up to beat, up to the minute with the classical music in the States. And that it was kind of a way for them to, just, continue to show off just how great and how splendid everything was. And Hadley made his conducting debut in 1900 at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. And by 1911, he was the conductor of the Seattle Symphony. And he wrote operas that were performed at the Metropolitan Opera House. And during the 1920s, he was the associate conductor at the New York Philharmonic. He was also the founder of the Tanglewood Classical Music Festival in Massachusetts that still runs today. This particular song, I've checked all of them to see if we know of any times they were performed on the fairgrounds. And this one is not. There is no record of it. And I got this information from looking at the daily, the little daily bulletins that they had for the fair, the daily schedules. So this particular song is dedicated to the Board of Lady Managers. It features this lovely image of the Cascades and Festival Hall on the cover. And like I said, this was one of the 3 official pieces composed for the fair. The other 2 were Hymn of the West and Louisiana March. Each one was published locally by the Thebes Sterling Music Company. They were the sole music publishers for the fair, which, considering there were only 3 official pieces, it's kind of a pointless title, but it's good for them nonetheless. So both the hymn and the march sold for a grand total of 75 cents, whereas the waltz sold for 60 cents. And here we have a photograph of the Cascades and the Grand Basin. And while there is some artistic license taken with, the illustration, it's pretty accurate, actually. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that a lot of these promotional materials, like sheet music, postcards, other souvenirs, things like that, they had to be made ahead of time, because they had to be made available when people arrived on the fairgrounds. Otherwise, if you open up Disneyland and there's no one can get any Mickey Mouse ears, what was the point? So it's kind of a similar thing. You kind of need the souvenirs so that people, spend that extra money on the way out. And St. Louis was by no means the only city to have hosted a World's Fair or Grand Exposition or something like that. And so a number of the pieces that we'll see that came out a little bit earlier, or that were perhaps sent to the press a little bit earlier, have cover illustrations that are almost generic. But that said, this one is very splendid. It's a really lovely illustration. And, it's a really great way to market the success of the fair. It's also a really great way for you to, buy that, take it home, have it on your piano, and then, it's absolutely a talking point. And you can, tell all of the visitors to your home all the wonderful things that you've seen. So the next piece is titled Hymn of the West. And the lyrics were written by Edmund Clarence Stedman, and the music was by John Knowles Payne. So the cover illustration is definitely challenging, for lack of better words. And it's a very kind of direct reference to this kind of notion of manifest destiny and westward expansion, and these kind of early exploration and colonization efforts. And, these notions of colonization continue into the lyrics of the song. The final words of the song are "the land of the new and lordlier race." And this concept is really important to note, though, because the official name of the fair was the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, and the Louisiana Purchase was a sale of land that was already home to thousands of indigenous people, and it allowed for the continued colonization of the United States. And so I'm not going to spend too much more time, digging into that, but I think it's definitely something that we should not shy away from when you're talking about the fair. So this is the lyricist, Edmund Clarence Stedman, a very distinguished looking man. And he was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1833. He spent most of his career as an essayist, a journalist, and a poet. He was actually a field correspondent during the Civil War and wrote for the New York World newspaper. And the music was written by John Knowles Payne. And Payne was born in Maine to a pretty musical family. He had family members that worked as instrument makers, music teachers, composers, some relatives that owned music stores. So a really, really musical family. And they were really well connected within the music industry on the East Coast. And, Payne took music lessons as a child and continued his studies. He studied in Europe. He toured a lot because he was apparently a very skilled and talented organist. And when he returned to the United States, he joined the faculty of Harvard University, and became the first officially appointed music professor in the United States. So Payne went on to, he was an incredibly important figure in American classical music and is sort of known alongside some other composers for kind of putting American classical music in conversation with European classical music, which up until the early 20th century was really the predominant place to look for, the best of the best. So the final piece of sheet music from the fair was the Louisiana March, which was composed by a man named Frank Vanderstucken. And the cover illustration is really quite lovely. And it shows fairgoers in front of Carl Bitter's Louisiana Purchase Monument. Bitter was a really talented and prominent Austrian-American sculptor. Among tons of other stuff, he's the designer of the Thomas Jefferson statue that's in the Missouri History Museum. And this is Vanderstucken, another very distinguished looking man. He was actually born in Fredericksburg, Texas in 1858, but at a really young age, his family moved back to Belgium where his father was from. And while he was in Belgium, he started studying music in Antwerp, and he worked and toured throughout Europe for quite a number of years, and then eventually returned to the States. And while in the States, he was the director of the chorus and orchestra for the National Conservatory of Music in New York, and he was the leader of the Arian Society, which was a German-American musical society that was around in the 19th century in the U.S. And kind of fizzled, kind of died around the time of World War I. And he was also the musical director of the Temple Emmanuel in New York. And Vanderstucken was really fond of German classical composers, especially Wagner. He was also supported by Hungarian composer Franz Liszt during his touring in Europe. And, I think given that St. Louis has such deep German roots and heritage, it's not really surprising that they would have enlisted someone like him to write a song for the fair. And according to a little biography that's written inside of the piece of sheet music, the song is, quote, a thoroughly musical opus worked out in a very original manner in which the composer incidentally uses snatches of the Marseillaise, Dixie's Land, Hail Columbia, and Old Hundred. And eventually, Vanderstucken returned to Europe, where he settled in Germany, and he died at the age of 70 in Hamburg. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about that official sheet music publisher of the fair, the Thebes Sterling Music Company. And the company's president was a man named Arthur C. Thebes, and the vice president was a man named Frederick C. Sterling. The company was incorporated in 1894, so they were first located at 1111 Olive, and then they moved their showroom and offices to 1118 Olive. Eventually, they commissioned Theodore Linck, well-known architect, to design them a brand new building at 1006 Olive in the heart of what would become known as Music Row. And the company made their name kind of manufacturing and selling pianos, music strings, mandolins, guitars. They boasted that they had the best collection of sheet music in the West. And they also sold Regina music boxes, which are kind of precursors to piano rolls and player pianos. They're kind of like giant music boxes. And one of only a couple things we have in the objects collection from Thebes Sterling is one of their music boxes. It is not small at all. It's probably the size of this podium. And they had a really extensive catalog of Catholic church music, which gave them a really good they had a really strong reputation across North America. Their trade territory was really quite vast. So it was the central and southern states, Canada, Mexico, Hawaii, and parts of Germany as well. And they also, a bit unusual at the time, they also carried music that was specifically marketed towards Black musicians, which is pretty unusual. I'm not sure why they decided to have that aspect to their business, but that was something that they were well known for. And both Thebes and Sterling did really, really well for themselves. Thebes had a house built in Compton Heights. Sterling moved into a house on Vandeventer Place, which doesn't exist anymore, but is sort of near Grand Center today. In 1909, Sterling left the company and started his own business venture, and the company was renamed the House of Thebes, which is a great name. In 1919, the company was sold sold to the Wurlitzer Company, and it remained in business through the Great Depression. And today, the Thebes Sterling building, as well as the Balmer and Weber Music Building, which is next door, are the only two remaining buildings from Music Row. And just for reference, if you're downtown, they're the buildings that are directly across the street from the Thaxton at 10th and Olive. And another funny thing is that when they announced that they were having Theodore Linck to design their new building, Balmer and Weber enlisted another prominent architect, H.W. Kirchner, and had them build an adjacent building that was 1 floor higher. So the next piece we're going to look at is a song called the Louisiana Purchase Exposition March. There are a lot of songs that have titles very similar to this. It was written by a man named Al Brown and arranged by G.W. Ashley and dedicated to John A. Wakefield. Unfortunately, our copy is in quite poor condition, which is why the side is cut off. However, there is a copy in the back that is in much better condition, so you can see all of the edges. And the cover features Charles Henry Niehouse's Apotheosis of St. Louis, which was originally made of plaster. And in 1906, it was cast in bronze and gifted to the city. And this is an image of the sculpture as it would have been seen at the fair. The base of the statue has another sculpture on it titled St. Louis and Her Guiding Spirits. And on the sheet music cover, below that statue, it's a little bit hard to see, but since we have an original in the back, you'll be able to see it closer. There's a map of St. Louis, or a map of the United States, sorry, in green. The Louisiana Purchase territory is in red, and there are all of these lines kind of emanating to St. Louis. And the portrait on the cover is not of Al Brown, but it is in fact of John A. Wakefield. And Wakefield was from Omaha. He came to St. Louis in 1903, and he was named the director of concessions and admissions for the fair. And afterwards, he headed to Portland, Oregon to work at the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, where he had the same position. So I'm going to talk briefly about the composer. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of him. But he's a pretty fascinating guy. So Al Brown made his name as a songwriter. He primarily wrote vaudeville and like songs for variety shows, both touring and in New York. He was kind of just a working class songwriter because that was a job you could totally have at that point in time. And his biggest hit was a show called Broadway Brevities of 1922. And it ran on Broadway for 18 weeks before it started touring. And he was enlisted to write a follow-up show in 1923. And he was also enlisted to work on a new production that was called Runnin' Wild. However, Al Brown had pretty poor health for most of his life. He struggled significantly with hyperthyroidism. He actually developed a pretty severe goiter and underwent, a lifetime of surgeries to kind of manage his symptoms. And in 1924, he died during one of those routine surgeries. But during that particular time, the show Runnin' Wild that Al Brown was supposed to have worked on was handed over to a different director. And the show was completed, and all of the music, from my understanding, was not completed when they handed the show over. And the music was completed by some composers with pretty notable names, James P. Johnson, Cecil Mack, and Aubrey Lyles. And if any of those names sound familiar, and if the name of the show Runnin' Wild sounds familiar, that's because the most well-known song that came out of that show was a song called The Charleston. And Victor Kremer was the publisher of this sheet music. Victor Kremer was a really prolific sheet music publisher. He started in the publishing business in the late 1890s, and his company grew to have distribution branches in 14 cities, both in the US and internationally. And he primarily published cakewalks and rags. And by the 19-teens, Kremer stopped publishing under his own name and went to work with a man named Carl Laemmle. And he followed Laemmle to New York and eventually to California. And Laemmle is a pretty important guy because he went on to establish a company that was known as the Universal Film Manufacturing Company, which later changed names to Universal Studios. And ultimately, though, Kremer left the entertainment industry and became a real estate developer. And he actually developed a small town in California called Cardiff by the Sea. That's just north of San Diego. And there is a kind of historic district in the town that's, I think, called like the Musicians District or something, and all of the streets are named after classical composers. So kind of a fun little aside. So I picked this piece entirely because of the cover, because I soon found out that there was very little information about the composer and the publisher. So this particular piece, the World's Fair Souvenir March, again, this name pops up, variations of the song title like this pops up over and over again. So not a lot of creativity there. This particular piece was written by Oscar Harold and published by the Herald Publishing Company. The Herald Publishing Company probably didn't exist. It was just a self-published piece of music, and he needed a name to put on there. The 1904 St. Louis City Directory lists one person by the name Oscar Harold. He was a salesman at a jewelry company. He resided on Henrietta, which is kind of off of South Grand, behind the old Gallaudet School, kind of by Slough. And one of the only things I could find out about Oscar Harold, aside from the fact that he was a jewelry salesman, was that he was a member of the Beethoven Musical Society. And at this particular point in time, musical societies and clubs were really, really common. Depending on the group, they were people who they were professional musicians, they were amateur musicians. Some of them catered to just women, some of them catered to younger kids. And, some focused on, like this Beethoven Musical Society, it was kind of an appreciation society. Whereas there were other groups where people would bring in songs that they had written and they would share them or, perform for one another. And so it's likely that he just, was in this group, had a desire to write a song and wrote a song. And the most notable aspect of this piece is the references and the color choices to the flag of the city of St. Louis. So at this particular point in time, the city did not have an official flag. There were a few different unofficial flags, but nothing that had the kind of seal of approval of local government. And in the 1960s, a call went out for new flag designs. And this is one of them. This is one of Theodore Sizer's designs for the flag. It was drawn in 1963. Eventually, one of Sizer's other designs was adopted as the official flag of the city of St. Louis in 1964. And while I have no real way of knowing if Sizer ever saw this piece of sheet music, which I sincerely doubt that he did, it's a fun story. And once you see the flag on that cover, you can't unsee it. So I'm subjecting everyone to to that.
Hey, I just noticed that it was dedicated to David R. Francis too.
Almost every song is dedicated to David R. Francis. It is an unremarkable thing. Once you've seen a lot of pieces, everything was dedicated to him. So now I'm going to kind of pivot and turn our attention to the Pike. So this is our first piece of sheet music that is inspired by the Pike. The song is titled Hike to the Pike. It was written by Edward Brown Claypool and was published by Thebes Sterling. As you can see, proudly referring to themselves as the publishers of the official World's Fair sheet music. Such an important title. And Claypool was born in Baltimore in the 1880s. He started playing piano at a really young age and was primarily self-taught. He kind of began submitting pieces that he had written to local publishing houses when he was still in high school. And he didn't really abandon songwriting or performing, but as a young man, he got a job as a court clerk. His brothers worked in the legal system, as did his father. And that was kind of his main job. And then on the side, he wrote and published music. And so while he was holding down this job as a clerk, he wrote this particular song, and apparently it was a big hit. And as we can see, it's the musical sensation. And we have this advertisement here for the song from the Globe Democrat. And the Music Trade Review, which is a kind of music trade and criticism publication that came out at the time, covered the music at the fair pretty extensively. And there's an article from July 9th that notes that Thebes Sterling had previously distributed 50,000 lapel pins promoting Hike to the Pike, and that they had planned to distribute 25,000 more. And they stated that Hike to the Pike was, quote, a fetching and popular composition. It is a ready and rapid seller, and the bands and orchestras in and around St. Louis and the fair are playing it right along. So this is one of the only other items in the objects collection that we have from Thebes Sterling, and it is one of those little pinbacks. It's like the size of a quarter. It's very, very small, but it's pretty cool. And, Claypool published music kind of sporadically during, up until about the 19 teens. And then he kind of went into overdrive and started cranking out a ton of stuff. His most popular song was a ragtime piece entitled Ragging the Scale, which was a pretty big hit towards the end of the ragtime era, so late 19 teens. But it kind of came back into popularity a few years later when Paul Whiteman's orchestra recorded it, as did Eddie Lang's Blue Five. And Claypool continued to publish pieces on and off until his death in 1951. Until 1951. He retired that same year after 45 years in the legal system and also publishing music. And he died the following year in 1952. So this is one of my favorite pieces that we have. The cover is just really, really striking. And to my knowledge, this is one of the only pieces that shows a roller chair. I can't say it's the only one because I have not seen everything. But to my knowledge, this is probably the only one, if not, one of just a small number of songs that show that roller chair on the cover. And this is a cyanotype of a roller chair that was used at the fair. And, they're pretty popular. You could rent them with a guide. This particular illustration shows the guide behind the woman in the chair. There's also a lot of references to other attractions on the Pike. You can see a pretty direct reference to these performers from the Mysterious Asia exhibit and the gentleman standing in the back. There are also camel rides were quite popular. And then, you have references to all sorts of buildings and stuff, but it's a really, really striking cover. It's really one of my favorites. And Up and Down the Pike was written by a man named Raphael Fassett, and it was published by a man named Frank K. Root. And both Fassett and Root came from pretty interesting and artistic families. So Fassett was born in Cook County, Illinois, in the 1860s. His parents were really successful photographers. However, they lost their business during the Chicago fire, and the family relocated to Washington, D.C. His father, S.M. Fassett, was a really, really prominent photographer. He photographed a lot of Civil War generals, a lot of politicians early on, and a lot of the most well-known photos of President Lincoln's funeral were done by S.M. Fassett. And his mother, Cornelia Adele Strong Fassett, was a really, really talented painter. And her best known work is an enormous painting of the 1877-78 Electoral Commission, which was also known as the Tilden Hayes Electoral Commission. And that particular picture is still in the collection of the U.S. Supreme Court today. And Fassett worked in the music industry, started out as a piano tuner. He then married into a really wealthy family and kind of continued to perform and write music until his death in 1915. The publisher, Frank K. Root, came from a more musical family. He was born in the 1850s in New Jersey. His father, Ebenezer Root, was the founder of the Root and Caddy Publishing Company, which is a massive music publishing company that had a lot of success during the Civil War. They were the largest sheet music publisher in Chicago until the mid-19th century. And they survived basically until the Chicago fire caused them to go bankrupt. And, while his father was a publisher of Civil War era songs, his uncle, George F. Root, wrote a lot of songs with a woman named Fanny Crosby. Crosby is perhaps one of the most well-known composers of both secular and religious music from the 19th century. She wrote all kinds of really, really well-known songs that if you go to church, you probably sing them. And just the last note about Frank K. Root is that he published tons and tons of stuff, but the most well-known song that he probably published was the Burt Williams song, I Ain't Got No Body. So this is one of the few pieces that I could find that was written about a specific attraction on the Pike. And this is a really good example of when I was working on this project of going through our sheet music collection, which is probably over 10,000 pieces. I was trying to, there are song titles that are really obvious in their relation to the fair. This one is not. It could have referred to the actual event, or it could have referred to, the attraction. It could have referred to, a remembrance of the event. So you can't always tell by the title. And this particular piece was self-published. It was written by a woman named Maddie Josephine Atkins, and the music was by a man named Adolph Edgren. And the Galveston Flood attraction was what it sounded like. And what I find really interesting about this is that the Galveston flood remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. And approximately, the number varies, but about 8,000 people died. And about a third of the population of Galveston that did not, that survived was left homeless after this event. So to be honest, I think it's a pretty bleak thing to base an attraction on. I sort of, when I talk about this, I kind of tell people that I liken it to, like the Twister ride at Universal Studios. And as someone who has grown up in St. Louis and has been tornado adjacent for the past 30 some odd years of my life, I can attest that I did not enjoy the Twister ride. And I would imagine, and as a person who's had multiple basement floods in the last 5 years, I don't think I would have enjoyed this either. But, even at the bargain price of a whopping 25 cents at the time, I think I'd have saved my quarter for something else. The sheet music also includes words for a song titled New York to the North Pole. The music for both songs is exactly the same. It's just the lyrics are different. New York and the North Pole, New York to the North Pole, another big attraction, kind of started with scenes of the New York skyline and the East River, a creation of a storm at sea, and lastly, a recreation of the Aurora Borealis of the land of the midnight sun, which is just Norway. So the song lyrics were written by a woman named Maddie Josephine Atkins. She was a writer, a poet, a lecturer. She was a graduate of the Emerson School of Oratory in Boston, and eventually she became a singer. And other than that, I don't really know much else about her. There was not a lot out there about her. And Adolf Edgren, there's a little bit more about him. He was a Swedish musician and a graduate of the Royal Academy of Music in Stockholm, and he wrote all kinds of pieces that were performed at different expositions across the US. And eventually he settled in Washington, and he was just a working musician, a working classical musician and church musician, and he continued to perform until he passed away in 1921. So this particular piece is the namesake of the presentation. I just think it's a great title. It's very catchy, and I like the illustration as well. So Piking to the Pike features all kinds of different references to different attractions on the Pike. So here we have a couple of those. There are also some really clear references to the Mysterious Asia as well, which you can see, if you look really closely, you can see that some of their references are really, really specific, which is kind of fun. And like the other pieces I've been talking about, there's not much known about these composers. I couldn't find any record that a person named C.N. Alden or Burton McKay lived in St. Louis during the time that this particular piece of music was written, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything because there were tons of people who moved to St. Louis, to work on the fairgrounds or to just work in St. Louis in general because there was a huge influx of visitors to the city, so there was no shortage of employment opportunities. And, they probably came to St. Louis for the fair, did whatever, wrote a piece of sheet music, and then left. There's also little to nothing known about the Pike Music Company. However, the address itself does offer some clues. So 210 Olive was the location of the Panama Building, and this building was home to two sheet music publishers. One was a man named George G. Zarn, and the other was the Stark Publishing Company. And John Stark moved to St. Louis in 1900 from Sedalia. The family was originally from Kentucky. And he set up business at 210 Olive before he moved to Laclede Avenue and eventually to New York before he returned to St. Louis. And if the name Stark sounds familiar, it's because he was one of the premier publishers of ragtime music in the United States. He published the works of James Scott, Arthur Marshall, Joseph Lamb, Scott Joplin, just to name a few. An incredibly important figure in music history and ragtime history as well. And if you open this particular piece of music, the inside cover features an excerpt of the song called John Henry March and Two-Step, and the back cover features an excerpt of a song called Kyrene. Both of those songs were written by Edelman Justice Stark, or E.J. Stark, who is John Stark's son. So it's likely that Piking the Pike was what's referred to as a vanity pressing, and that means that somebody probably paid Stark to use his publishing or his printing equipment, and this was a one-off piece that was self-published. They paid to have it printed, and as kind of a way of, I guess, kind of still getting that Stark stamp on it, that's why they included those other Stark pieces. So kind of an interesting way of kind of using sheet music to figure out some other stuff. So while there's really nothing known about either the composer or the lyricist or anything like that, and I sincerely doubt that the Pike Music Company was an actual company, I can say with a certain level of certainty that it was probably just somebody who paid, Stark some money to have their piece printed. So this song has the longest title of any song in the presentation. The full title of the song is Eliza Simpkins, Daughter of Uncle C, for the Dance Was Held At. So unsurprisingly, it's just known as Eliza Simpkins. It was written by Theron C. Bennett and published by Victor Kremer, who we learned about a little bit earlier. And I'm kind of using this song to talk about Bennett. So I did some digging and I could find a lot of mentions of at least one person in the western part of Missouri who was named Eliza Simpkins. I have no clue if she was the inspiration for the song. I really doubt it. She was not a young lady in 1904. She was like 90-some years old. So I don't think it was her. I don't think she was traveling across the state. I could be wrong, but I don't think it was her. And here we have an advertisement that mentions the song alongside a few other songs that we've talked about from the fair. And Bennett's a really fascinating guy. He was born in Pierce City, Missouri in the 1870s, and he worked as a traveling salesman for Victor Kremer. And eventually, though, Kremer found out that he wrote pretty good songs, so he started publishing his work. And Bennett wrote and published songs between 1902 and 1925, so a little over 2 decades. And he primarily focused on rags, and he continued to write and perform and eventually opened a restaurant called the Dutch Mill Cafe in Denver. It's part cafe, part music store. It's kind of a local hub for creatives. I think it might still be open. And in the 1920s, Bennett moved to California. He led a few different jazz bands, and he remained in California for the rest of his life. He, like a lot of other people, really, really struggled during the Great Depression. He lost most of his assets. And didn't really recover from that. And after a long illness, he passed away in 1937. And so I've selected St. Louis Tickle for a few different reasons. First and foremost, it's probably my favorite actual song of all the ones I've talked about today. So no one has, to my knowledge, and I did a lot of digging and a lot of asking around, to my knowledge, nobody has ever recorded an album or a significant amount of some of the more obscure World's Fair music. Most of the stuff that there are recordings of are things like rags, because ragtime was so popular that it has more longevity than like a march or a waltz did. And St. Louis Tickle was released on, we actually know because Stark, well, not Stark, because this is a Victor Kremer piece, but there are some really good there's really good record keeping for kind of rags and ragtime. A lot of scholarship has been done with that. So this particular song was released on August 20th, 1904. It was recorded onto piano roll in 1905 and 1906. The 1906 recording was by Wes Osman, a banjo player. It was probably his biggest hit. As an aside, Wes Osman is buried in Valhalla Cemetery. Don't know why he's not from St. Louis, but a really, really important banjo player from the turn of the century. And for many, many years, ragtime historians and musicians debated about who Barney and Seymour were. Nobody knew who this Barney and Seymour was. However, local, ragtime musician and historian Traber Titchener is a name I'm sure some of you are familiar with. He's seen seated there at the piano. He theorized in the 1950s and 60s that Barney and Seymour was in fact a pseudonym for Theron C. Bennett. And today, this is one of those things that, we have things like newspapers.com where there are all of these newspapers that are digitized. And so you can really quickly type in something and see if it pops up. And I could have answered Traber's question instantly today. However, that was not available. In order to find that information, he would have had to go through newspapers and go page by page looking for ads to see if that song is mentioned. And there are ads from the time period that note that Bennett is the composer behind the tune. Traber's theory and a lot of the theories of the other ragtime historians and musicians at the time, it was based purely on the music of the song and the song itself. And Traber was a really, really exquisite composer and a musician and a historian. And he was really, really well connected. He had a band, the St. Louis Ragtimers. They were fixtures of Gaslight Square. and they were really interconnected with the jazz and folk and blues revivals that were happening at this point in time. And it was during this time that Traber befriended a folk musician by the name of Dave Van Ronk. And Dave Van Ronk was a kind of staple of the kind of folk music scene in Greenwich Village. He specialized in ragtime guitar and was heavily influenced by early 20th century music. He performed in Gaslight Square a few times, and according to Traber's family, who I know quite well, I just went on a walk with his daughter Virginia when she was in town last week. So according to Traber's family, Traber actually introduced Van Ronk to the song St. Louis Tickle one time when he was in town. Van Ronk fell in love with the song, and he recorded it a few different times in his career. And this is a big giant journey I'm taking you on with this song. To kind of bring all of this full circle, I found this really small directory in our collection that's maybe, I would say like maybe 2x4, 2x5, really small kind of pocket-sized directory that came with a local publication called the Ragtime Review. And in this directory, there are all sorts of names of collectors and musicians, and one of those names is Dave Van Ronk. And it's very tiny, but you can see it at the bottom. It says folk singer. But, to my knowledge, Traber and Van Ronk were friends throughout the rest of their careers. Whenever one of them was in town or where the other one was, they would often meet up. And Van Ronk died in 2002 and Traber died in 2014. And I just think this is a really great example of how a song can have so many different things can come from just one piece of music, right? Like, these people, they liked the song, they learned the song, they continued to keep the life of the song alive, many decades after it is finished. And the last thing I'll say is if that particular Dave Van Ronk album cover looks a little bit familiar, it's because his life was the inspiration for the Coen Brothers movie Inside Llewyn Davis. And the next piece we're going to look at is the St. Louis Rag. St. Louis Rag was written by Tom Turpin and published by Saul Bloom in 1903. Turpin was born in Georgia in the 1870s, and by the turn of the century, he was living and working in St. Louis. He and his brother Charles Turpin were proprietors of various enterprises, including the incredibly well-known Rosebud Bar or Rosebud Cafe, Rosebud Saloon. It had a bunch of different names. His brother Charles Turpin was also the first Black elected official in the city of St. Louis. Turpin published he was the first Black composer to have a rag published. It was the Harlem Rag. It was published in 1897 in St. Louis. The St. Louis Rag was published in 1903 before the fair happened. The illustration of the fairgrounds is not entirely accurate, but I think it kind of still gets the vibe of the fair, right? I think it's kind of an intentional that they're kind of drawing that curtain back to kind of give you like a little sneak peek of what's to come. So this piece was published by Saul Bloom, and until I did this particular presentation, I just knew Saul Bloom as a sheet music publisher, but it turns out he's a pretty interesting guy. So he was born in 1870 in outside of Peoria, Illinois. He developed the Midway Plaisance at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, and he's the one who's kind of would design the Midway, and the use of the word Midway kind of came into the American lexicon and kind of cemented itself as that kind of everyone knows what a Midway is after he developed this thing that had such great success. Eventually he became a branch manager for M. Whitmark and Sons in Chicago. Whitmark was one of the largest sheet music publishers in the US. Eventually Bloom moved to New York. He stayed in the sheet music business, but then also got into real estate. He actually had the first musical copyright of the 20th century, and he continued to publish for a few years. In the 1920s, though, he got into politics and never returned to music. And in 1923, he was actually elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was the representative for the 19th and 20th districts in New York, which covered the west side of Manhattan. He was the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee during World War II, and he was part of the U.S. delegation at the convention in San Francisco that established the UN. And he was also said to have written the opening words of the UN Charter. So a guy I had no idea he was into that he did anything after publishing sheet music. But really his political career lasted until he died in 1949 at the age of 78. So his political career far outlived his sheet music publishing career. So the last couple things I'm going to look at are songs that I could not do this presentation without mentioning. The first of which is Cascades, which was published in 1904 by John Stark and Son in St. Louis. So like Along the Plaza, features a really lovely and grand image of the Cascades. And, despite popular belief, there was no real evidence that Joplin ever performed at the fair. However, he was absolutely in St. Louis at this point in time, but there's no real evidence that he performed at the fair. That said, though, it's entirely likely that he attended the fair or at least performed. If he did perform at all, it could have been at a venue on or near the Pike. There is no note that there is a note that he attended the fair at one point with another musician, but there's no record of him actually performing. And during this time period, Joplin struggled significantly with his personal life. So in 1903, he and his wife Belle had separated after years of really difficult marriage and the death of their only child. And in June 1904, he married a woman named Freddie Alexander. He really seemed to have had a really deep connection and really loving relationship. However, she became ill, and within 4 months of their marriage, she had passed away. And he really, by all accounts, he really loved Freddie quite a bit. And he dedicated the song The Chrysanthemum to her. And after her death, he didn't publish anything until March of 1905 when he released the song Bethina. And Bethina is, I highly encourage you to seek it out if you haven't heard it before. It's quite a sad song. It's a really pretty song. It's probably one of my favorite Joplin pieces. And Alfred Ernst was the director of the St. Louis Choral Symphony, which we now know as the Symphony Orchestra. And he had a really great respect for Joplin. And he stated that, Joplin was, quote, an extraordinary genius as a composer of ragtime music. And he wanted to take him to Germany, actually, to show off his musical talents, but the trip never actually came to fruition. And Joplin had a really classical approach to ragtime. He did have some formal training, but surprisingly, a lot of, it's kind of funny, by today's standards, I'm sure he was a phenomenal piano player. However, at the time, a lot of his contemporaries noted that anyone could beat him in a piano contest, that he was a better composer than he was a piano player, which I think if anybody heard him play today, I think if he just appeared and played the piano, we'd all probably be amazed. But given that there were so many piano players and some of them were so insanely talented, it's really hard to, I find it very funny that, apparently Joplin wasn't that great. But while I'm on Joplin, I do want to mention the whole concept of ragtime at the fair. So because I've talked about tons of ragtime pieces and stuff that's ragtime adjacent. And while ragtime wasn't kind of officially allowed at the fair, I have found that not to be true entirely. There's a fair amount, not a ton of information, but there actually is evidence that on several occasions, rags were played at the fair. And for instance, on June 21st, at Wiles Band of St. Louis played at the Plaza of St. Louis, and they opened their set with The Entertainer. On another day, it's October 24th, and at the Cascade Gardens, Wiles Band of St. Louis opened with a song that was called The St. Louis March, written by a man named Tom Turpin. Tom Turpin never wrote a song called The St. Louis March. He wrote The St. Louis Rag. So I have come to suspect, I'm kind of working on, I'm going to work with some other musicians as well. But I actually have a pretty decent sized list now that takes up about a page and a half of references to songs that definitely fall into the realm of ragtime that were performed on the fairgrounds. And one of the interesting things about some of them is that they just drop the word rag from the song. To kind of, I guess, make it seem like it's not a rag. Like there's a famous rag called carbolic acid. That one is listed as being a march. It is not a march. But there's all of that is to say is that there's some conflicting information out there. And while the Cascades was never performed, to my knowledge, on the fairgrounds, ragtime was. They just said it wasn't. And now I don't know what it sounded like, but as someone who is married to a person who plays a lot of ragtime festivals, I know what it sounds like, and I've heard all kinds of things from, there were ragtime orchestras, there were full brass bands that did ragtime arrangements, so it's possible that it wasn't just somebody sitting at a piano, but ragtime was really, really popular, and I think if there had been absolutely no ragtime at all whatsoever on the fairgrounds, it would have been a little bit unusual, to be honest, because the other thing I'll say is that at the time, Scott Joplin, was obviously well known. The Entertainer is the first piece of sheet music to sell 1 million copies. Ragtime was incredibly popular. However, most Americans, if you ask them, to name a ragtime composer, they wouldn't have said Joplin. They would have said Irving Berlin. And that's because Irving Berlin wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band, which was an incredibly popular song. And so it's just, all of that is to say is it's complicated. It's a little confusing. There's some more work to be done. But it absolutely was a thing that happened at the fair, despite popular belief. And I couldn't get to the end of this presentation without mentioning Meet Me in St. Louis. So the lyrics were written by Andrew B. Sterling, the music by Carrie Mills. The song was published by F.A. Mills. Along with the Cascades, it's probably the most well-known and recognizable piece of sheet music from the fair. The song was really popular when it was first released. It was popular with musicians like Arthur Collins and Billy Murray, who recorded the song really early on. However, the song kind of faded and ended up making its Hollywood comeback in the 1940s. It actually first appeared on screen in a 1941 movie called The Strawberry Blonde, which had Jimmy Cagney, Olivia de Havilland, and Rita Hayworth, and a very small role played by George Reeves, future Superman. And in 1944, that was when it ended up in the movie Meet Me in St. Louis. And I kind of wouldn't argue that it wasn't until that film came out that this song kind of came back around and cemented itself in American popular culture. Because I always tell people, think about the timing. This movie came out in 1944. That was 40 years after the fair had ended. You had people who were perhaps children or young adults who visited the fair, and then they were able to watch this movie with their kids, with their grandkids, with other family members, and it just hit that like nostalgia button real hard. And it obviously, Judy Garland was, quite possibly the biggest name, one of the biggest names in entertainment at the time as well. So, it's no surprise that it kind of ended up as an integral part of the fair story. And so as I wrap up, I just hope that I've told some more unusual stories about the fair and given some kind of new life to forgotten composers. For every piece that I've shown, there is so much more that I could have shown. Our collection at the Librarian Research Center, which you're free to come by and see anytime we're open, has about a little more than 50 individual titles in it. It's including duplicate pieces. It's close to maybe 100 actual pieces of music. So it's, there's a lot of stuff there. I hope that everyone enjoyed themselves. Like I said, I have a little bit of time. I know we're running out of time, but I have a little bit of time. If anybody has a quick question, but I also have my business card as well if anybody wants to follow up with me later. But thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Magdalene, that was excellent. So hang around up here so you can answer some questions while you get a drink and stuff. We'll take several questions and I'll go ahead and repeat them for the people on the internet. Up front here.
How could you listen to this music?
How-
Do you have things at the library or we just Google?
So
How could you listen to the various music pieces?
So, to my knowledge, the only songs that there are recordings of are the like ragtime songs and like Meet Me in St. Louis. There aren't recordings available. I don't think anybody has ever recorded, well, I don't want to say ever, but like to my knowledge, nobody really has recorded any of that more obscure stuff. So somebody would have to sit down and play it on a piano. The Joplin stuff, the Tom Turpin, the Theron Bennett, all of that's easy enough to find just, on YouTube. There's plenty of, recordings of it and stuff. But yeah, for more than half of what was in this presentation, to my knowledge, there are no recordings that exist of any of those songs.
Tickle Me is.
St. Louis Tickle? Oh, yeah, there's tons of recordings of St. Louis Tickle. Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah.
I can tell you back in 2020 during COVID, since we couldn't have meetings, we published some e-meetings, which were about a 7 or 8 page PDF with all sorts of links. And those are located on our website. If you go down to meetings and look under e-meetings in 2020, you'll find some of those. And I can recall for 3 or 4 of the 7 or 8 months that I did, I had a half page or so of links to World's Fair music out on the web, including ragtime and, things like this.
There's, you had Piking the Pike
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
Back there is another song, Piking the Pike. And the phrase says, come pike the pike with me. Come take a pike at the pike with me. So is pike also a verb?
Okay, so the question was, is pike also a verb with all the different titles of piking the pike and et cetera, et cetera?
So what I will say is when I originally did this project of kind of trying to find all of the pieces in our collection that had to do with the fair, there's a lot of duplicate song titles. It kind of seems like some of the duplicate song titles are really generic, like, Louisiana Purchase Exposition March. There's like 10 of those. And I think Piking the Pike is probably an example of that. I think it's really catchy. I used it for the name of this presentation for that reason. But I think it's one of those things that like somebody said it once and it got stuck in their head. And here we are, 100 some odd years later, still talking about it. But what's funny is that copy of Piking the Pike back there is not the same yeah, but that's just one of those things that like, I didn't know that there was another song called Piking the Pike, but I'm really not surprised having looked at so much of the sheet music in the past year or so. That, like I said, the number of duplicate titles everything is dedicated to David R. Francis. Everything has the same name, basically. It's very hard sometimes to make a list of all the individual titles. It took a lot of work.
Aside from the presence of your husband in your life, what happened in your past that made you be riveted by this musical form that predates you by several generations?
Did you say the question?
Yeah. So this is kind of asking what got me interested in music, basically, this type of music. So I will say I had old grandparents. My grandparents were born, my mother's parents were born in the South. They were born in the early 1920s, and which was a little bit unusual, I've come to find out, to have such a big age gap. My grandparents were in their 80s when they passed away. And my grandfather loved music. He had a massive record collection. I studied music. I briefly played in orchestra when I was in school. I was not that great, despite a decade of trying. And I went to college and I did kind of focused on Black studies, but I really liked early to mid 20th century kind of American popular culture is kind of my thing. I studied a lot of fashion, and then with fashion comes, everything else that's happening. And so music is obviously a part of that, but really I just like old music. There's no good answer really, unfortunately. I know it's unusual, but I will say as someone who occasionally goes to various ragtime festivals with my husband or, early traditional jazz festivals and stuff, there are a lot of older people, but there are younger people as well. Myself and my husband included in that. But I think it's important to kind of, as an aside, just important to keep a lot of those traditions alive and a lot of to honor those musicians because they were really, really important. And I don't think that, people don't know the name Tom Turpin as well as they know the name Scott Joplin, but they probably should. And you could say that, and I could say that I could stand up here and just talk about random musicians that nobody in this room has ever heard of for like hours, because that's what my head is full of. But I just think that it's just always really important to me. Like I said, I came from a family that really loved music. For many years, I was a record collector as well. So that, didn't help anything.
Can we stop your screen
Oh, yeah,
share so that
absolutely.
people out there can see your answers?
Yeah.
There's a question in back. Yes.
The gentleman in the front row, memory serves Washington University has some good music online.
Yeah. And they've digitized, I don't know that they have recordings, but I know that they've digitized, they do. And I know that they've digitized a lot of their sheet music images. We are in the process of doing that as well on our website. There's a finding aid for our collection of World's Fair sheet music that you can find on our website, and we're in the process of getting all of the images uploaded as well.
And my question for you is, have you researched, because I'm a musician, have you researched how many people actually purchase the sheet music and just plop it on their piano with a picture? And how many people actually sat down?
I don't know that, I don't know that you could know. I don't know that there would be a way to know that. But what I will say is that for, decades and decades, having a piano in your house was incredibly common.
Right.
And it was for a lot of people, even if you didn't own your own home, buying a piano, a lot of music stores allowed you to kind of make payment installments, so it was an affordable thing, even if it took you a while to get it. But a lot of people, that was a way for them to pass on wealth to their next generation, was like, oh, I bought this really lovely, this really beautiful piano. And that trend continued up until, probably the 60s. Which is why now so many people have pianos that they want to get rid of. And I have 3 at my house. But I think people, people bought sheet music because they wanted to play it. I think people kind of today, a lot of people don't, most people can't read music, but I think it was much, much more common in the early 20th century for people to be, musical to the extent where they could sit down at a piano and kind of basically get through a song. So while it would be uncommon today, I think at the time it was definitely, I think more people probably played the music than we might think.
And you study Black studies and so on. What did you think about, St. Louis Tickle, of course, had its stereotypical, but really, and I have a large collection of St. Louis World's Fair music, but not very many really that had the stereotype, considering how all of those songs from that time period, that's really bad stereotype. I always kind of wondered I thought that was kind of interesting. And now also on the St. Louis Tickle, the little boys are looking through the fairs. Did you ever think about that, or can you research that as far as the amount of Black people who were actually at the fair?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that there's a lot of contradictory information, about African Americans at the fair. They were supposed to have Negro Day and then it got canceled. Local newspapers, Black newspapers encouraged people to boycott the fair. That said, though, there are oral histories of local, prominent Black St. Louisans who went to the fair and talked about it in these glowing terms and talked about how fun it was and how great of a time they had and how they went back on more than one occasion and this, that, and the other. And so, it's all very contradictory. And the other thing I will say is that, and I talked with Mike about this before, earlier I guess last week. And one of the things that I mentioned was that it's at the time, while today we kind of I think most people kind of think of ragtime as it's quaint, it's not offensive, it's, it is what it is. But at the time, there was just as much pushback from the Black community as there was from the white community when ragtime started to get popular. A lot of prominent Black musicians who did classical music or church music, a lot of them were really against ragtime because they thought that it was not promoting their race in a good way. They thought it was raucous and it was uncouth, and that it was, it was not moving their people forward. And a lot of people in the Black community didn't like that. And that always like makes people are always surprised when I tell them that. But then what I kind of encourage people to think about is that's happened throughout the entirety of music, right? So anytime there's like a new musical genre or something that gets really popular, there's always people who don't like it. There's the same people who, not, you talk about hip hop, you can talk about rock and roll, you can talk about punk, you can talk about any other musical genre where there's a lot of pushback, but there's pushback from within the community that music is coming from, as well as from outside. One of the things my husband always tells people is that like, when people kind of want him to commiserate with them when they're like, oh, these kids today and they're like music. Mind you, my husband is younger than I am, and his response to people is like, well, that's fine, but you're not the target audience, so it really shouldn't bother you. Like they're not making it for you. And so at the time, if you have that thought though and apply that to ragtime though, it's the same thing. Scott Joplin wasn't making music for like 95-year-old people who wanted to listen to like polkas. Like that wasn't his target audience. Like it just wasn't. Like not everything has to be for everyone. But I think it's kind of an interesting, it just lends itself to kind of the contradictions and the kind of, it's just really difficult it's just, I'm just talking in circles, but like, I think all that does is just show how complicated some of those topics are. Like, there is no good answer for any of this stuff. Like, it's just, you have to talk about it and think about it. And like, maybe your thoughts will change. Maybe they won't. Like, maybe we'll learn something new one day. Maybe we won't. I don't know. I've learned, within all of this, information about ragtime being played at the fair, this is all information that when I was sharing it with some coworkers of mine, they had never heard of this. And these are people who have worked at the institution longer than I've been alive. So, it's quite a while. And so, there's all kinds of stuff still to be learned, and, things to explore. But I just think I think St. Louis Tickle that's one of the reasons why I picked it. It's such a good example. It has like so many things. There's so many things about it that lead you to talk about other things, and lead you to explore other aspects of the fair and of music and of popular culture at that time.
Amen.
Mhm.
Oh, go ahead, Benita.
Okay, this isn't exactly what you're talking about, but like Nelly, he's the.
Mhm. Yeah.
And he has 2 shows.
Mhm.
And I have the credit, he has a show for adults, I guess, and then he has one for kids.
Mhm.
Where he doesn't use the language.
Mhm.
So, and one way we're kind of talking, kind of like that.
Mhm.
But I always have to give him kind of credit.
Mhm.
I heard that, and I think that.
Yeah, no, like I said, my husband always tells it to people kind of half as a joke, half being serious. But my mother was a retired kindergarten teacher, and one of the things she was always telling people is not everything is for you. Like it's a good lesson to live your life by. It's just not everything is for everybody all the time. That's just not how the world works.
I have a question for you. The fair wanted to bring out the best in
Mm-hmm.
advanced culture,
Mm-hmm.
European, American, etc., including music.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had a music department who had a big budget to bring in
Mm-hmm.
Alexander Guimont and the organ and perform pieces in festival hall and from the bandstands that were uplifting and educational,
Mhm,
etc. And there was other music that was more popular that made its way into sheet music, etc. And as you said, was probably performed on the Pike here and there. And through the years, a lot of that popular music kind of faded in interest. And for some of us of the age who remember a movie with Robert Redford in it called The Sting in the 1970s, it, I believe, almost resurrected ragtime
yeah.
from just being almost forgotten to being hey, this is pretty cool music.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been, revived to where there's groups going around, and Doug is a big fan of it. We've got Jim Weimers, who's a big fan of World's Fair sheet music and has a great collection, et cetera. Can you comment on anything I've said, or, am I kind of on target with some of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think what's interesting is that there's this kind of schism, right, between them saying that like they want to promote like what is, the kind of top of the top, like the cream of the crop for everything. But what's kind of interesting about that is that at that particular point in time, it's only in hindsight that we kind of look at some of these ragtime composers with such high regard, right? At the time, like Alfred Ernst really did like Scott Joplin's music. However, John Philip Sousa, who provided tons of music for the fair, John Philip Sousa hated ragtime, couldn't stand it, thought it was awful. And so, complained about it ad nauseum. And so it's this kind of interesting back and forth that you have between what does everybody like and what's the best, so to speak. And that can go for any aspect of culture, really. You have things where, even today, it's like the most popular movies aren't necessarily the best movies, but that doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that people are getting something out of it that is different than what, critics are getting out of it, or the people in charge are getting out of it, so to speak. So there's kind of an interesting kind of dialogue there, that I think happens not only in music, but that happens all over culture, right? That's not a thing that's exclusive to music, because a lot of these things, it's only in hindsight that we recognize, the contributions of some of these people to American popular music, right? Like, Scott Joplin, incredibly popular, died basically broke in New York, alone, without any money, and then like that was it. And there are other composers that, like Joseph Lamb. Joseph Lamb, I didn't talk about him in the presentation. He didn't write any World's Fair sheet music, but he was a ragtime composer. Joseph Lamb, though, lived until the 1960s. And so he got to experience that revival, that like second wave that happened when people like Traber Titchener, the St. Louis Ragtimers, and some of these like Bob Darch, some of these Max Morath, like ragtime historians and musicians who were young at the time, started to take an interest in this music. And so that, I think, also feeds into it, is that like, it's who lasted the longest and was able to kind of see, get their appreciation, versus who was, they were just putting their art into the world and they didn't know if it was going to be any good or if anybody was going to like it. But nowadays, we all think, there's tons of ragtime festivals. I don't think Scott Joplin or like, Louis Chauvin or Tom Turpin or any ragtime composer would have thought that like, 120 years from now that people would still be, going to ragtime festivals that happen on an almost monthly basis across the United States. So, and it's not to say that there aren't classical, there's not, that there are plenty of classical music festivals and stuff, but as far as longevity is concerned, it always tends to be that popular stuff kind of sticks more. And sometimes when it has, this kind of, these other elements, it gives it that longevity and kind of allows us to then kind of give those people their, give them their dues, so to speak. Yeah.
Any other questions real quick?
Mhm.
One more.
I'll be fast. Yes, you.
I just had a comment.
Mhm.
I realized after I joined the society that my grandmother, she quit school and got a job just so that she could have money for the fair. She was 12. Her favorite music was Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. And it was a controversial thing
Mhm.
because the young people were really into it.
Oh, yeah.
And she told me her parents were just absolutely against
Oh, yeah.
the whole concept of ragtime. It's just like rock and roll.
Yeah, it's nothing new. Like,
And she was a 12-year-old and she
Yeah.
was totally into.
Oh, yeah, there's like, yeah.
The whole genre.
Oh yeah, that's why I tell people, I'm like, this is nothing new. Like this like problems that people have with like, rock and roll or hip hop or, any genre of music. None of these things are new. Like, we didn't come up with that. I'm sure that the first time somebody heard like, Ride of the Valkyries, that like there was somebody out there who was like, I hate this. I never want to hear it again. It is grating. Like this song is going nowhere. And like, it ended up in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. So what are you gonna do?
Doug, any questions from the internet?
No,
Nope. Okay.
Perfect.
just a request that all that music you just showed, that TJ and Ethan and all those guys could get together and play it for us.
Yeah, TJ's my husband. Ethan is the godfather of my child. His wife was in my wedding. So I know them all very, very well. But
Magdalene and Doug
yeah.
Stone are talking about some of the local
Yeah.
performers that are doing ragtime time here and there, and there's still a lot of them in St. Louis. and
Oh, yeah.
Doug is really into that.
There's a monthly ragtime rendezvous at O'Connell.
Yeah.
On the first Monday night of each month.
Yeah,
It won't
it's
be
very
on
good.
In July maybe, but.
Yeah, July is canceled because of the holiday.
It's-
Yeah, but in August, the
Cool.
band will be really good.
Doug, for those of you out there, Doug's talking about ragtime rendezvous at O'Connell's on Sundays, is it?
Mondays.
Monday night.
Monday
Monday,
nights.
first Monday of the month.
First Monday.
Well, with that, I want another round of applause for Magdalene and a great presentation. And I learned a lot. And now it's time for Doug to come over and be cameraman. And grab the camera. And we have two pieces of sheet music. One is Louisiana St. Louis Exposition Waltzes by Fred Ryder, who seems to be have his name on a lot of music.
Yes, he does.
Marches and waltzes and stuff. And Strolling the Pike with an interesting cartoon illustration. Piano orchestra band by Zarn.
George D. Zarn.
And lots of fun to do. So first name gets choice.
All right. Let's see. Hopefully it's not somebody who left.
Go ahead.
Oh, Ron Snowden. All
Ron
right.
Snowden. You want the Pike one? Okay, now stay up here for a photo
All
op.
right. Number 2,
You people with cameras, get ready.
Mary Ellen.
Mary Ellen.
She left. Oh,
Oh,
Should not
must be
laugh.
present
Must
to
be
win.
present.
right.
All you people out in Zoom land should have come. Marg Oliver. There she is.
Okay. All right.
So if you'll stand maybe in the middle and hand that to her.
Pass her music.
White wall.
And Jesse Tarbox Storm will take a picture here.
There you go.
You're welcome.
I've got a presentation, presenter speech too. Okay.
I look cute or fun. When they do one, or you should. Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, and don't go anywhere.
Thank you. I think you're free to go. Not me though.
So no.
Since COVID, it's haven't had too many opportunities to do this, but it's been a tradition in the World's Fair Society, going back to the founding of the society, to give a presenter, first-time presenter, a token of our appreciation to put on their desk or in their living room or something like that. This is a acetate World's Fair logo with it embedded in the middle of it that we'd like to give out. And Magdalene, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. Delayed flash.
Here we go. Sorry. My battery just said exhausted.
It's okay.
I hope you got a good one.
It's all good.
Okay,
Well,
so
thank you.
this is yours.
It'll go on my desk.
There's.
Take it again.
Oh, you got another camera there?
Yeah,
Oh, perfect.
take it again.
I'll hold it that time.
Okay.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Perfect.
Great. Well, that was absolutely fantastic and amazing. Looks putting the mounting the camera again.
Well, I think I am. I don't know what I'm doing. It's all yours.
Okay, we'll be wrapping up here in just a few minutes. I want to give a quick preview of upcoming meetings and events. Don't forget to sign up if you can for the setups at the History Museum. I'm going to be sending an email out to the board and almost everybody here and people that helped us at opening day to, get a couple of volunteers for each of those events. And also, if you're interested in the Sci-Fest on July 13th, there's an interest sheet back there. More will be coming in the bulletin on that. Then on Tuesday, July 9th, I'll be doing a presentation at the History Museum titled The Astonishing World's Fair. I'll share a lot of little-known stories about the fair, and you'll see the construction, some of the countless exhibits and buildings, the Ferris wheel, and what happened when the fair was over. And then I already told you about Saturday, July 20th at noon. We're going to have a great lunch and meet at Glen Echo Country Club to celebrate the 1904 Olympics, 120 years ago. One last question. Does anyone have any other questions, information about the fair, the society to share with other people, or for Magdalene?